Welcome, good thinkers. Welcome to our Monday morning, 9 a.m. Pacific time in the U.S. show, 4 p.m. Greenwich Mean Time. Welcome to Good Thinking Live, the conversation where all of you good thinkers are part of this show, where we set aside a little bit of time each week to think about our thinking. I'm so glad you're here streaming live from LinkedIn and from YouTube. So be sure, actually, I meant to put this in. Let us know who you are and where you're from. Got to get the banner in there, reminding everyone to check in to let us know who you are and where you're from. This is a topic that I have been thinking about and have looked to see where this is being discussed. And maybe just because I'm not seeing it doesn't mean it doesn't exist, right? Just because we don't see something in our own experience doesn't mean that there aren't millions of people who are seeing it and talking about it. But this is something I've had a hard time, at least with basic Googling, finding a lot of conversation. So I think we're going to have some fun with this conversation. Okay, let's welcome some good thinkers to the show. Arvind from India, welcome. Abdurrachid, regular good thinker, welcome to the show. Barkley, joining from Washington, D.C., welcome to the show. So let us know, keep them coming, let us know who you are, where you're from. And the fun thing about this show is that people are coming in from everywhere throughout the world. And this gives us a completely different perspective than a show that is more local, and a lot of shows maybe that would be from the United States. So I like this perspective, and it's actually necessary for this particular topic. So let me know who you are and where you're from, and let's participate. Here's the first question. We always start out with a question. Those of you regular good thinkers know that. Here's the question. What is a greater luxury? A, our access to information and the freedom of information. So this incredible access to information. And bear in mind, depending on where you're coming from, you could have a whole bunch of access. You could have the government limiting your access. There's all kinds of ways to think about access. But what is a bigger luxury? Access to information or our freedom from information, meaning a chance to sit still and think. What's a better luxury? A, our access to information, or B, our freedom from information? Freedom of information, A, freedom from information, B. What's a bigger luxury? All right, I'm going to be welcoming some good thinkers to the show. We've got Stephen, greetings from the Rose City. Welcome, Stephen. We've got Samuel from the UK. We've got Rusha from India. First timer. Yes. Welcome to Good Thinking. I hope that you become a regular part of Good Thinking, a regular good thinker. And we have got Jairam from India. Welcome. Rich from Latvia. Oh, no, sorry. Nina from Latvia. Oh, I have a very good friend from Latvia. Welcome, Nina. And we have got, okay, perfect. Good thinker. We've got Abdurrachid. What is the difference? Aha. Good question. And we have, okay, so Rich says A, access to information. Now, we're going to talk about freedom from information in a minute. That's the whole point. So that's the point of the show. So you're asking a great, good thinking question. Thank you very much. But so I'm going to talk about 3 different ways to think about freedom from information, because all we hear about is freedom of information. There have been some interesting developments in some countries that are starting to think about freedom from information. And so that's what this topic is about. So Arvind says in Arvind's opinion, option A, freedom of information is a greater luxury than freedom from information. I hope I'm not losing my internet connection. I'm seeing some little things. So if you see it being a little wobbly today, could be, you never know what could happen. Okay, so now let me take the banner off so I can make room for our comments. All right. Is information power if you can't process it, or is information potential power? So if you get information, if your physician gives you all kinds of information with all kinds of terminology, and you have all of this information and you don't have time to look up every word, but if that physician summarizes it for you, they summarize it in a way that they deem that, they decide for you how you should interpret it. They decide for you what you should know. What would you rather have? Would you rather have all the information with all the terminology for you to decipher? Or would you rather have someone take it all, make sense of it for you, and hand it to you? And what type of information do you want freedom of information? And what type of information do you want freedom from information? You want someone to tell you what to think. Maybe with medical information. You want some doctor, back in the day, the doctors would just say, okay, this is what you have. And you say, well, wait a minute, where are the tests? This is what you have. This is what you should take. And you followed along. Now, everyone here, at least in the United States, you got to be your own advocate. You can look up all the information. What would you rather do? Would you rather have freedom of information, or would you have freedom from information? And there are 3 different ways to think about freedom from information. I'll get into that. Meanwhile, Arvin says option A. Abdurrashid says freedom of information means authorization to access information. It's different because depending on where you are, that's a good question. Depending on where you are, you may not need authorization. Freedom of information means that whatever's information that's available, you have a right to it. Who should be the authority keeping you from information? That's kind of freedom of information. And we can talk about what the Freedom of Information Act has meant in the United States and how that looks, and how a freedom from information has looked in France. So we're going to get into that. But there's 3 different ways to think about information that you have a right to know. Okay. Freedom of information, authorization to access. Okay. So number 1, you have a right to know. Number 2, you have a right to share. And number 3, you have a right to avoid. So does your right to know get in the way of your right to avoid? Does your right to share get in my way of my right to avoid? And when you think about that, there are 3 ways to think about these questions. Ready? There are societal obligations. How many of you have heard silence is violence? If you don't respond to something that you think or someone else thinks or your society thinks is really important, you're not standing against this or standing for that, or that silence is violence. Now it rhymes, but is it true? And I see this a lot because there's so much that we are supposed to know about. Maybe you're supposed to know about Johnny Depp and Amber Heard, and you're supposed to know about mass shootings, atrocities, or maybe you're supposed to know about atrocities that are happening in villages about which you have not even begun to think about. But for people who live there, that's super important. Society obligates us to know so much. And this gets to how much are you obligated to check the news every day? On a scale of 1, I feel no obligation to check the news every day. And 5, I feel completely less than in some way if I don't check the news every day. Where are you on the scale? This is a societal obligation. All right. So 1, I don't feel any urge to check the news every day. 2, I feel totally out of sorts if I don't check the news every day. Who's going to admit it first? Bonus points to the first person who admits how they feel about the news. And this is kind of where the right to information, freedom of information, kind of coincides with freedom from information. Because if you're feeling this, I've got to absorb all this information, and maybe it's the news, then what you're absorbing is what people decide for you, because there's so much information that doesn't make the news. All right. Thank you. I'm going to say hi to a few more people. We have got Patrina from Canada, and we have got, let's see. All right. We've got some good ones. Okay. So we've got Arup from India. Okay. Welcome, Katrina and Arup. Okay. So Abdurrashid says 3. So 3 is kind of a mushy. I always say, you're not allowed to say 3 because that's neither here nor there. If you had to say, ignore 3. Are you more like, I can ignore it, or I feel this intense pressure, depending on the type of information? Okay. 1, LinkedIn Learning, whoever that is, might show up in the scroll, but this is what I see. 1, you don't feel the need at all. 7, that's even more than a 5, right? You feel an intense need to follow the news. Stephen says, I'm not obligated to check the news every day, but I definitely am addicted to doing so. Okay, so what's the difference between an obligation and an addiction? Arup says 2. So I'm going to give rubber chickens to everyone who put a number down about how they feel. And this is, if you are feeling this intense pressure to pay attention to the news, and the news is just, maybe what comes into your phone or what comes onto your computer or what's decided for you, that may mean that the idea of a freedom from information is something you should consider. All right. What about this? What about work obligations? So there's societal obligations. I've got to pay attention to the news. I've got to have an opinion about things that people tell me I have to have an opinion about. I don't necessarily, so I look and see, okay, what is my team saying that I should think? My political team or my, whatever team. What does my team say that I should think? Because I don't have time to deeply research all these issues, but I'm expected to have a strong opinion. What do you do when you are expected to have a strong opinion and you don't have time to really understand both sides or all sides? You don't have time to have a strong opinion. I suggest you hold the opinion a little loosely. And also, freedom from information means you literally do not have to have an opinion about everything. It's very liberating. All right, we've got Arup says 2, and we've got Rusha says 2. So some of you good thinkers here are not obligated to check the news every day, but you feel a little sense. A 2 is like, oh, maybe I should look at it. All right. So what about work? What do you think about a right to disconnect from work? Freedom from information at work. We talked about freedom from information in society. Now we're talking about the second kind, freedom from information from work. Now, we've got these blurred lines. We want to have freedom of working when we want to work, when it works best for us. We suggest our bosses don't tell us unless it's specifically necessary that we need to work from this hour to this hour. As long as we can get our work done, they should care about the skills that we bring and the work that we produce, not when or where or how. So if we don't have those guardrails, so there's this blurred line, we're working out of the house, we're working at home, everywhere is work. How do we think about freedom from information from work? All right. So next question. 1, I don't care if it's after hours. I'm not checking email. I'm not responding to texts. Or 5, if it's after hours, there are no after hours. Anytime I get an email, anytime I get a text, I am on. Or if I'm not, I feel this stressed out little sense of, oh my gosh, I'm cautious, I'm cognizant of ignoring those texts and emails. Where are you? 1, hey, when I'm off, I'm off. I maybe have flexible hours or I maybe have specific hours, but if I get an email, or if I get a text, I don't feel anything where I need to respond. That's a 1. And a 5 is I just have to respond. And maybe a 4 is I feel a need to respond, so mostly I do. Okay, Patrina says 3. Patrina says 3. Barkley says 4. Come on now, be honest. Someone says 2. You think that's a function of your job? Do you feel this pull to respond? We talked about society. Do you feel this need to have a strong opinion on all the things that people are talking about? What about work? This says the sign of true intelligence is the ability to hold 2 opposing thoughts and still be able to function. Yeah, I call that quantum thinking. Turn off the media sources. Let's see. After you have toasted a news appetizer. I love it. Stephen feels a 3. Fair enough. Let's see. After Rachid says 4 because it helps me prepare my to-do list. Okay. You feel more organized if you don't push things off. Okay. And then we said, Arup, only super important stuff, nothing else. So you have to look at it, right, to see if it's important. So then you feel an obligation to look at it and assess. So you're attending to it. So that's not freedom from information, but it's freedom. You have freedom to decide. That's different. So you're not freedom from information. I like that distinction. Thank you very much for that good distinction. Rich says 4. Rich feels a strong, probably you have a job where it's like, you've got to be responding at all the hours of the day. Should you have a right to disconnect? The right to disconnect is described as the ability of people to disconnect from work and primarily not engage in work-related communication, electronic communication, emails or messages during what are non-work hours. How many of you think that that's a human right? How many of you think that that's a human right? Now, I might say, what are work hours? I don't have any time that's work hours versus not work hours. It's all work and it's all this. And I could be on a hike and I'm responding to emails. So that mushiness, like, it's not a human right because we don't even have a distinction between work hours. But do you think the right to disconnect is a human right? Yes or no? Put it in the chat. Let's hear it. Let's hear it. Do you think that the right to disconnect is a human right? LinkedIn, okay. Nope, not a human right. Patrina says yes, a human right. Rusha says 4. So Rusha feels an obligation to respond to the emails, but not like a 5 where you absolutely do. Arvin says the right to disconnect is a human right. All right. Well, this is interesting because you are not alone. There have been some other countries that have thought that this is a human right. Back in 2006, this was before COVID, obviously, when home became work. Maybe it will always be that way, or for some of us or most of us. But the French government adopted a labor law that included the right to disconnect. So I'm going to get into that, but I want to see what you guys say. So you guys think it's a human right. Rich says, I think it's a human right, the right to disconnect. Mansour says, I think it's a human right. Arup says, yes, I think it should be. Yes. Yes. Jairam says, yes. So a human right. Okay. Question. Let's see. And important to show my children the balance and my full attention. Absolutely. What does it mean when you don't give your loved ones your full attention? It means that they're not as important as whatever you're attending to. That's just a fact. It depends on the type of work. If physical, you can disconnect by resting, but if it's mental, even if you leave the office, your brain will keep functioning. Absolutely. Yes, absolutely. All right. So this French law, tell me what you think about this French law. But before I do, Barclay says important, but not a human right. Barclay says important, but not a human right. And I like that distinction. Otherwise, it couldn't be violated by our own feelings. And I think that's good. I think it's important to understand that a human right, it can't be violated by our own feelings. I'm going to give a bonus point to that because that's deep thinking. That gets a deep thinking. All right, let's talk about this French law. Let me know what you think. Okay. This took effect on January 1st, 2017, and it refers to employers' obligations to stop encroaching on their employees' personal and family lives with calls and emails. So under this right to disconnect, employees don't have to take calls or read emails related to work during their time off. Time off. What a concept, right? It was confirmed by the 2016 law. It was the concept of the right to disconnect, but the French code doesn't clearly identify how the right to disconnect is implemented. Like so many laws, so many ideas, that we think is a good idea, but the implementation is mushy. It just feels good to say that, but the implementation is mushy. And that's how this French law, I think, has kind of played out because the right to disconnect is taken seriously, as there was a 2018 ruling that says an employee is entitled to extra pay whenever they're asked to be available to take work-related phone calls outside of their regular work hours. So here's the deal. If you're getting paid extra to be on 24/7, is that a good thing? Or does that create unintended consequences? Do our human brains need the right to disconnect from work? And is that different than the right to disconnect and have strong opinions about social issues? Social issues. What do you think? Because the third category has to do with personal. The freedom from information from personal. People sharing things with you. People texting you at all hours. And this obligation where you feel like, oh, I'm being rude if I don't respond to this text, or I'm being rude if I don't respond to this email. So we've got society where we're told silence is violence. You have to have an opinion about everything. If something tragic happens in your country or in the US a lot, we all have to kind of be aware of it, even though something completely as tragic could be occurring, some typhoon in the Philippines about which we know nothing, but we don't comment on that. So is that silence violence? Should we have a strong opinion on that? There's too much information for us to have strong opinions about everything that is available for us to have opinions. So should we earn the right to have an opinion, or are we obligated to have an opinion? Because our access to information means that we have our freedom of information doesn't allow for freedom from information. What do you think? What about society? When you get a text or an email or someone shares something and you wish they hadn't shared it because you just can't keep up with all this stuff, like, stop sharing this crap, stop sharing this with me. How do you feel? Do you wish they would just stop sharing it? What do you care? It's because you have this feeling of reciprocity. Someone shares something, you can't just ignore it because it does something. You feel, maybe you're excited to respond, you're not excited to respond, you're busy, but you feel an obligation to respond. What about freedom from information from our friends and family? What do you think? When you have some email or text message, whatever, from a friend, 1, I don't care, I focus on what I'm doing. 5, I feel, even if I'm busy and don't respond right away, I feel uncomfortable, like I'm not doing something that I should be doing. Which one is it? 1, 5. No freedom from information? I mean, total freedom from information, 1. No freedom from information, 5. Even if it's internal, you feel this kind of stress that you've got to respond. I've got to respond. I know I shouldn't, but I've got to respond. Where do you feel? Put it in the chat. Let's see. We've got societal, we've got work, and now we're doing personal. Freedom from personal information. So after Raja says, when it came to a day off or holiday, I consider it a human right, especially mental jobs. Interesting. Okay. So this LinkedIn, says, if someone sends me something to share or text or email, I don't feel anything. I can get to it when I get to it. I don't even think, I should. That's good. That's freedom from information. And Patrina says 4. There is this feeling that you feel like this obligation from close friends and family. Stephen says 4. And I guess, it depends, but close friends and family are probably the ones that have your text ability to text. That's why I think that it's weird to give, to not even create boundaries for people that you meet. Send me email for this. I'm going to do this. Send me text for this. We feel rude if we put guardrails around how much people have access to you. Like, who am I to put guardrails around? I mean, famous people put guardrails all the time, but that's to be expected. They have to because they've got so much. But at what point do we have so much too that we shouldn't feel obligated or worried about being called a jerk because we didn't respond in time? Do we have freedom from information? Or does our freedom of information obligate us in some certain way? All right. So Arup says 1. Abduracha says 1, by turning off notifications that violates time management. Absolutely. You can turn off notifications. Perfect. So it looks like a lot of you have more control over your social friends and family obligations than over your work obligations. Because you're like, well, my boss might, expect that. But what are the unintended consequences of choosing your own hours and being flexible and being on all the time? It's freedom of information. I should be able to do this and that and this and that and get this information. I should be able to get all the information from my doctor. But that obligates us to do more research, to put more guardrails, to think more deeply. Now, Rusha says 5. And I think that's a more honest, I think the higher answers are more honest for a lot of people, where they say, I don't necessarily want to respond every wet time. I'm enjoying a hike or I'm doing something, but this feeling like I feel like I have to. I want to say that I'm a 1 personally, but I know that I'm not. And it somewhat depends. It depends on who it is. But I've gotten texts and emails and I've had friends say, go respond to that. And I'm like, I'm not going to don't decide for me what I'm going to respond to right away. Or they'll say, it's okay if you respond. Like, I need permission to respond. Now, I think it's polite to say, we're going to have dinner tonight. I'm in the middle of a negotiation. My child is sick. I'm waiting to hear from, someone about something. If I interrupt this conversation to check my email, it's only because of that, to let people know. But it's probably better to let the other end know, unless it's an emergency. I'm not the kind of person that's going to be responding all the time. Your lack of planning or your emergency or your need to know to give me information to share. I mean, I got an email, a text message the other day with an attachment. It was shortly after another tragedy in the United States, another mass shooting, and it was my opinion on a particular kind of idea and legislation. And I didn't respond because I was busy with other things. And then I got a nasty message a couple of hours later, a frustrated message, not nasty necessarily, saying, why didn't you respond? And what did you think? And da-da-da. And I thought to myself, because you were curious about my opinion about an article that was like, a 15-minute article to read and then formulate an opinion and think about it. But no, they wanted an opinion right away. What's your opinion on this? Sorry, I was busy. Okay, so Patrina says, as a new entrepreneur, I have to block out time for my children and I will always be on. Right. And you hear that. And, you try to go get funding for your company and you tell them you're going to do this. They're going to be like, no, an entrepreneur is on all day, every day. Do we have freedom from information? All right. So what about so we have a civil right in the United States, which is, a right to know stuff, autonomy, liberty, all that stuff that we have here. But the Freedom of Information Act was enacted more than 50 years ago to give citizens the right to obtain documents from federal agencies. And it was a way for journalists to petition to get information from the U.S. government, to be able to report. The Fourth Estate in the United States, the Fourth Estate is considered, the fourth branch is considered the media or journalists. So there are exceptions that are made, but, you used to be, that was the Freedom of Information Act was like, you have freedom of information. Now they can put in all kinds of exemptions for security, and that becomes very subjective. Time has not been so kind to the Freedom of Information Act. And one study found that the New York Times alone had filed 31 freedom of information lawsuits during Barack Obama's years alone. So whatever. So we have a freedom, a perceived or some kind of freedom of information. But so far, we don't have anything like in France, where we have a freedom from information. How many of you have given thought to what you would want a freedom from information to look like? I mean, information assaults us, whether we're awake, semi-conscious. Do you have a right to see information? Do you feel that if there's something you're curious about, you have a right to know? Maybe it's about a celebrity, a science finding, something that contradicts something that other people are. What do you have a right to know? And, should you have access to your own medical records? And if you take that right, are you ready to take the obligation? Are you ready to take the obligation? Because with information, if you're given the information without it being summarized, without it being handed to you, with some kind of way to think about it, then it's your obligation to think about it, right? So if you have access to all your medical records, instead of what your doctor decides, you're obligated to make sense of this information. Do you have a freedom from information? In what contexts? What about our next generation of smart communications that will go? When AI decides to overload you to the point where you have no choice but to rely on machines to help you make sense of information, which, by the way, a lot of the information we get from online, social media, whatever, is exactly that. We think we're choosing that information. And then we're being fed, if you like this, you should like this. If you like this, you should like this. So what about this? And all of a sudden we think that we're caring about, Amber Heard and Johnny Depp. Like we made that decision to care about that trial or, something else. Do we have freedom from these bots telling us what to think? I mean, it's kind of nice that they filter out the stuff and they feed us the stuff we really want. It's kind of nice. We don't have to go through all that stuff. But do we have a freedom from it? Do we have a freedom from bots, artificial intelligence, sharing information with us? Do we have freedom of our bosses or our friends or society sharing information with us? Can freedom from information reduce unnecessary obligations, like having strong opinions about things that we don't have time to even think about. So we just look to see what people who think like us and what's their opinion. Oh, yeah, that sounds right. How do we give ourselves time to think if we don't have freedom from information? Do you set aside time to think? How hard do you make it to have a strong opinion? Do you have strong opinions where you couldn't even describe and can't even understand how people could think differently? If you do, and you can't describe or understand how people would think differently, you may need to hold those opinions loosely. And you think, well, how does that relate to freedom from information? Well, freedom from information means that you can choose not to have a strong opinion about things that you don't have time to access. So if there's all this stuff that everyone's talking about, and it's all this news or all these trendy topics or all these trendy ways of thinking, and you don't see it, don't hear it, don't read it, don't formulate an opinion about that, because maybe you're busy in the lab studying the molecular structure of something that's going to, save the planet. But you might not have a strong opinion about some social issue. You may not be shouting from the social media pulpit about some social issue. What does the freedom of information give us? And I'll leave this with one final question. Are we moving toward a time when freedom from information may become just as important as freedom of information? Are we moving to a time when freedom from information is just as important as freedom of information? Share it in the chat. We're out of time. Keep the conversations going. I'd like to kind of start thinking about this. And so why not good thinkers? Keep the conversation going. Thank you for being here. See you next Monday, 9 a.m. Pacific time in the U.S., 4 p.m. Greenwich Mean Time on LinkedIn Live and YouTube Live. If you want notifications, go to YouTube, check Becky Saltzman, hit that notification, subscribe button. Let's think together. Have a great week.